BSides DC would like to thank all of our sponsors, and a special thank you to all of our speakers, volunteers, and organizers for making 2018 a success.
Hello, my name is Nick Stevens. Is it, okay, sorry. So my name is Nick. I'm going to be talking about Huawei's Fingerprint Authentication, but mostly their TrustZone implementation. If you don't know what TrustZone is, I'm going to go over all of that. This talk's mostly going to be about memory corruption bugs and how to exploit them in Huawei products, and less so about like a biometric bypass, which you might expect from the title of the talk. So the goal of this talk is to find a chain of memory corruption bugs in Huawei's TrustZone architecture to completely compromise the phone and then disable the fingerprint sensor. So a little bit about myself before the talk really gets started. I play on the Shellfish CTF team. If you don't know what CTF is, it stands for Capture the Flag. It's a sort of a simulated hacking exercise where teams compete against each other to break into each other's computers. Most of the time this involves like fake pieces of software, so organizers will write a bunch of fake code or a bunch of fake like email servers or web servers, and it's up to the players of the game to find bugs and then write exploits for those. And typically these are memory corruption bugs or crypto bugs, so it's mostly like application security, auditing skills at play here. Some other things I've done is I worked on the Cyber Grand Challenge, so that was an automated CTF competition put on by DARPA. I've also published a number of research papers on topics like automated exploitation and automated bug finding. And then I've also done some research on the TrustZone, which I'm going to talk today, that I've also published papers on. So in general, I just play a lot of CTF, which is one of the ways I was able to acquire the background necessary to do this kind of research. Another thing is I actually work currently for Raytheon CSI as a vulnerability researcher. So if at the end of this talk, if you decide this is something that you would like to do as a job, feel free to talk to me afterwards. We're always hiring, and this is the kind of thing I do every day. So now to the actual talk. The goal is to completely compromise the Huawei P9, and I have it actually right here. I'll be demonstrating the exploit on later. So we want to go from an untrusted app, which is an Android sandbox SE Linux context, which essentially is any app that you have on your phone that you download from the Play Store and you give no permissions to, that's going to become an untrusted app. So all the default apps on your phone or the apps that you're downloading are all considered to be untrusted, and they're put into a sandbox that limits what they can do. So we're going to go from that position and we're going to completely compromise something known as the TEE. This stands for the Trusted Execution Environment. And this is actually sort of a more recent and non-traditional security layer that is actually seen on a lot of Android phones now. I'm going to be talking more about exactly what that is. And then once we're in this the most trusted layer of execution, or the most trusted ring, we're going to completely disable the fingerprint sensor, which executes in this context. So if you're unfamiliar with the TrustZone, it sort of divides, sort of adds some new trust boundaries actually to the security architecture. So if you've taken an OS class, you might be familiar with the differences between Userland and Kernel. That's sort of the most typical trust boundary. And in this case, like on your desktop computer, if you compromise your Linux kernel or your Windows kernel, you've completely owned the machine. You have all the permissions to do anything you want. You can escalate your privileges arbitrarily. But on an Android phone or on a phone running on an ARM chip, you have the ability to enable something called the TrustZone, which is sort of like a shadow world, which adds another layer of permission boundaries. So you have another kernel called the TOS, and you have another set of trusted applications which all exist outside of the scope of the kernel. So the T is the most privileged layer here, and it has the permission to read anything within the Android world on the left, the green side, but the Android world does not have permission to read anything in the blue world, the T world. So just to break down some examples of things you see at these different permission levels, at the lowest level in Userland, you have things like Chrome, your browser, you have all your applications. Then you have your kernel in Android, which resembles Linux with a couple of different lines added for like networking permissions. And then you have this T with the trusted apps. These don't have names. You won't be familiar with these applications, but they do things like handle secure storage, secure payment, There's something called the trusted UI in Huawei's case. I don't actually know what that does. I think it has something to do with the PIN. And then you also need another kernel to support these applications because they want to do things like map memory and perform IPC. So you have all these different layers. So to begin really, or to start exploiting a trusted app or take complete control of it, we're going to go through and we're going to individually compromise every single layer starting at Userland. So we're going to be exploiting bugs in Huawei's Android kernel, which is Linux. So there's actually a kernel module in particular that we'll be exploiting. Then once we have root on the phone, so that first stage in green is sort of like rooting an Android phone. Once we have root, we're going to escalate into the T. So we're going to take over one of the trusted applications that we can find bugs in. Now, once we've done that, we still actually don't have complete control over the T. So just to clarify, while the T has more permission than the Android world, the green world, or the normal world, we still need to get trusted kernel code execution to completely read out physical memory and modify anything at will. So we're going to need to find a bug in the trusted OS once we found a bug in the trusted app. So each one of these stages is going to be a memory corruption bug that we exploit, and I'm going to be going over how we topple each stage. So before I get started on the actual bugs and how the TrustZone architecture of Huawei works, I am at a standpoint here where I'm already assuming that I'm executing code on the device, and this isn't really a fair assumption for an attacker. So a more realistic chain might be getting code execution in the web browser like Chrome. People find bugs all the time in web browsers, and then from there, you would begin executing a payload which does this chain. So this is all possible to do remotely as well. You just need a couple more bugs in one of your Userland applications. So a little bit about who is making these trust zones. So as I mentioned before, the trust zone is actually an ARM technology, so it's something that comes on your SoC, your socket on a chip, but it's part of the ARM spec, but every single chip manufacturer is implementing their own trust zone. So some of the chip manufacturers that you have on Android phones are Qualcomm, which is probably the most common in the United States, but Huawei has their own chip manufacturer known as HiSilicon, which is Chinese. This also reminds me this is probably a good time to mention what Huawei is. If people aren't familiar, Huawei is a Chinese phone manufacturer. They also make networking gear. I'm sorry, I actually skipped over this part because I just have been using it for so long, but they're not actually very common in the United States because they have a lot of difficulty getting into the US market because they're blocked by like Congress. It's not easy for them to sell merchandise here, but they're actually really common, of course, in China, but also in Europe and parts of South America. So Huawei is this very popular cheap device that you don't see in the US. But they have all their own stuff to support this. So while they use ARM, which is a type of processor, which almost all Android phones use, they're not using Qualcomm technology. Although some of their phones do, they're using their own in-house HiSilicon. And another thing that makes the T interesting is that unlike the rest of Android, which is sort of forced to be open source in some aspects, the trust zone is not, there's no obligation for Huawei to publish the source code for any of their trust zones. So this is all things you have to reverse engineer off the phone. Now, luckily for the first stage of bug, they are forced to open source their kernel modules, so we can do source code auditing for the first stage, but after that, once we want to begin exploiting the trusted apps and the trusted OS, we're going to need to begin reverse engineering. So how does a normal Android app actually talk to the trust zone on Huawei? It's actually kind of a complicated song and dance we have to go through to start sending messages to things like the secure storage Trustlet. Now, one of the reasons we have this complicated outlook, and I'm going to be going through each stage, is that the trustlets themselves actually want to do permission checking, but because of the strange divide between the normal world and the secure world, the trustlets themselves have no insight into the permissions of the normal world. So all your UIDs and your SE Linux labels, those all exist in the Android kernel, and the trust zone has no idea that the system exists. So we need a way of communicating that between the two worlds. Now, to make matters more complicated, the instruction that we use on ARM to actually send up payloads and buffers and arguments and commands to the trustlets is a privileged instruction. So ARM actually introduced this instruction called SMC, so you sort of see it in the middle bar. I believe this stands for Secure Monitor Call. This is actually a call that will interrupt the trusted world, and it will allow the trusted world to take out any arguments in a register in memory and begin passing those off to trustlets. So to do this, Huawei introduces their own kernel driver. And there's a number of bugs in that. But the problem with the kernel driver is also, it's not easy for the kernel driver to look up all this information about particular apps, or at least Huawei found that it wasn't easy for them to look up information about particular apps making requests. So they introduced this T connection daemon, which will actually do the permission checkings for us. So this is a Userland component that's listening on a Unix domain socket, TCD, and it's going to be taking requests from our Android apps, and it will be deciding if the Android app is worthy, and then serializing a credential structure, sending that off to the kernel driver, and then it'll be the responsibility of the kernel driver to send that off to all the trustlets that want to do permission checking themselves. So our Android apps don't have direct permission to talk to the kernel driver, so it can't just open dev TZ driver. It has to talk to TCD, and then if TCD deems the app worthy, it will open up the driver. It's going to take that file descriptor, and then we'll actually send the file descriptor to our Android app using the Unix domain socket. So if you didn't know, this is actually kind of a cool POSIX thing. You can actually send file descriptors over Unix domain sockets. So once TCD has that file descriptor, it can wrap it up and pass it to our Android app, and now our Android app has a new file descriptor in its process, and it can use it to communicate to the kernel driver, which is known as TCNS client. Then once we have that, we can begin directly sending ioctls to the driver. And depending on what ioctl we send, there's one that's essentially called issue TrustZone command. The kernel driver will go off, it will execute an SMC to the trustlets, and then the SMC is, it's going to actually go to the trusted core. The trusted core is going to dispatch it to a trustlet, and then the trustlets will begin making their own system calls to the trusted core as need be, like for mapping memory and so forth. So you have all these sort of different parameters being passed around and crossing different trust boundaries here. So we're going to begin getting into the bugs now. So the very first step is targeting the TrustZone driver. So it turns out that on Huawei you can actually sort of authenticate to the TrustZone driver without actually having permissions to talk to any particular trustlet app. And you can still send commands to something known as the global task. So here I have a number of different things that the TrustZone driver is responsible for, like logging in the app, which I've already kind of mentioned, and proxying the calls. But something mostly interesting about this is that the TrustZone driver also has to handle the serialization of all these different parameters we're going to send up. So our trustlets are going to be expecting different kinds of arguments in the forms of memory references and integers. Now, the memory references are kind of interesting because the way we pass a lot of data up to the TrustZone is by actually just passing up literal pages of information. So we pass up these buffers. I'm going to be going over why that is, and there's two vulnerabilities here that we're going to exploit from an Android app to root the phone and take over the kernel driver. Now, as I've already mentioned, these two worlds, the normal world and the secure world, don't actually have a lot in common. The only thing that they do have in common, and one way they can sort of communicate with one another using sort of shared language, is through the physical addresses that they both know about. So the trusted core has a one-to-one virtual address space that's mapped to the physical address space. So what this means is that all the virtual addresses that the trusted core see, the values of those addresses are the exact same values as their corresponding physical addresses. Now, your Linux kernel or the Android kernel and Userland, this isn't the case. The virtual addresses themselves are not the same value as the physical address pages that they correspond to. But the kernel does have permissions to look up what the physical address values are of those virtual pages. So what the normal kernel is going to do to pass up pages to the trusted core, and it's going to find the memory reference that it's interested in. So say I'm a Userland app that wants to pass up a buffer to the trustlet, And what it's going to do is it's going to look up the physical page address of that buffer, and it's going to pass that to the trusted core. The trusted core is going to say, I know exactly what you're talking about. I know physical addresses as well. And then it's going to take that physical address and it's going to map it into the destination trustlet's address space. Now, this also becomes tricky because the destination trustlets exist in their own address space as well with ASLR. So just like your kernel and your userland apps in the normal world, your destination trustlets also are operating on virtual addresses that they don't know the physical addresses for. So you need this middleman, the trusted core, to take the physical addresses and convert them on both sides. Well, excuse me, to convert them on one side. The normal world kernel is going to handle converting them on its side before passing them to the trusted core. So this introduces some issue. In particular, this means they actually have to handle converting the virtual addresses we pass in into physical addresses. Now, the very first bug that we see is in this functionality. Now, when we want to pass up a buffer to the trustlet, what we need to do is actually register mappings with the kernel or with the TrustZone kernel driver. And the way Huawei decides to handle this is they implement a version of mmap. So if you're unfamiliar with the mmap system call in Linux, it essentially just allows you to allocate a new page or a number of pages in your process. So your heap and your stack all under the hood are using mmap. So they'll mmap in this new page using the file descriptor of the TrustZone driver, and once they see that mmap call occur, they say, okay, I'm now aware of this page. I'm going to add it to my list of known shared memory pages. And now once they know about this page, I'll allow any userland apps to make requests referencing this page, and they can pass up an offset into this page of where they want the information to begin. So as you can see, if you begin looking at this code, they're iterating over this linked list, and then they make sure that the length that we're passing in is less than the actual page or less than the actual shared memory region that we registered with. But then one thing that they don't check is they do share mem kernel adder plus client param memref offset. They never check the memref offset. So we can arbitrarily specify this. Now, what this means is we can actually go completely out of bounds of the page that we allocated, and we can go point to another physical page. Now, this wouldn't actually be interesting if this was just some page in our userland process, because we would just be specifying a page further down userland memory, but it's actually using the kernel address that corresponds to the userland address, and it's adding to that and then converting that to a physical page. So what this allows us to do is actually specify an arbitrary physical address and pass it up to the trusted core. Now, one might see how this can become an issue, because if we can pass about an arbitrary physical address to the trusted core, and the secure world has no idea about the different kinds of permissions in the normal world, the trusted core might begin writing to a physical page that belongs to the kernel and not to userland. So we can essentially use almost like a confused deputy attack, where the trusted core has more permissions than the kernel itself, but still wants to maintain permission boundaries of another world. Unfortunately, it has no way to do that, so it can write to a physical page that doesn't belong to the app which is making the request. So this allows us to essentially, in some ways, get an arbitrary write into the kernel. Now, we need functionality in the TrustZone that will write to the physical page we pass up, and I'll show that later. But another thing we need in kernel exploitation is a leak. So as I mentioned before, they have their own mmap implementation. So if you've ever done Linux kernel auditing before, Linux kernel driver auditing in particular, you'll know that they have this structure where they implement a number of different operations, such as open and ioctl, and they can also implement mmap. If you're unfamiliar with this, this is just a mechanism where the driver can essentially override a bunch of operations and implement their own versions of things like ioctl and mmap. So as you can see, they've implemented their own mmap, which I mentioned a couple of times, and now all this does is get a number of pages, register it into that linked list like I talked about, and then it will map the virtual address that we requested to the pages it got with get free pages. Now, this is kind of tricky because a lot of the mmap system is actually already handled by Linux proper, or the kernel itself, and the mmap that we implement only has the ability to do a couple of different things, pretty much only handle residual data that occurs because of the mmap. So Linux is going to be choosing the address that it wants the userland process to place this page at. And typically it also allocates memory already, so Huawei is completely just throwing that away. So as you can see, though, we will add this thing to the linked list. Now, this gets really interesting when they want to unmap something. So something that a naive kernel driver developer might not know about is that while you can implement mmap, you can't implement the inverse operation munmap. So you can't actually implement an operation that will munmap that area. Or completely get rid of the area in your address space or clean it up. So to handle this, they actually implemented a new ioctl handler called TC-NS client ioctl shared memory release. And what this does is it completely just unlinks the shared memory from the linked list. Now, that might seem okay because it will unlink it from the linked list and free the physical pages associated with it. But since this isn't going through munmap, what actually occurs is you have this issue where the underlying or the virtual address doesn't actually correspond to the physical pages which were just freed. So what this introduces is actually a dangling page in our userland process. So what will occur is we'll have a virtual address in our userland process which was never cleaned up because we're going through ioctl and not munmap. And we'll have that virtual address pointing to a physical page. So our page table will never actually be cleaned up. It will point to a physical page that the kernel considers free. And this causes all sorts of issues. So the kernel thinks this page is free, but our userland process can still actually read and write to that page. So this has a number of consequences. So if another process, for example, wants to unmap something and it needs a physical page from the kernel's going to say, oh, I have a free page right here, and it's going to give that exact same page to the userland process that our userland process has. Or the kernel might also use a physical page to allocate kernel data structures, which are incredibly sensitive. If you can overwrite kernel data structures as a userland process, you've also kind of owned the kernel. So this dangling bug has a number of repercussions. We can actually use it to get a leak by spraying inside of our kernel or using operations that allocate kernel data structures. So with these two primitives, what we're going to want to do is get code execution, obviously. Now, the way we're going to get code execution, and this is just one way of doing this. If you're familiar with Linux kernel exploitation, there's tons of ways to do this, and maybe even better ways. I chose to actually just overwrite the file operations pointer of a file. So the way files work in Linux is you have a file descriptor, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, but this file descriptor is just an integer. It's very opaque. So this actually correlates to a kernel structure, which is the file kernel structure, which has all the metadata associated with that file, such as the permissions of the file, its offset, but it also has this function pointer table, which is used to override the operations that we do on that file. So people who are familiar with Linux might also know that one of the great things about it is that a file descriptor can represent many different kinds of objects. It can represent like just a file on disk. It can represent a network socket. It can represent a kernel driver. The way all this is handled is by using this function pointer table to override the functionality of these different operations. So in this example, we have a legitimate table, the ext4 table, which is a file format on Linux, and that corresponds to all these legitimate operations. Now, we want to point that file operations pointer table into userland, where we can control the values in that table and actually point it to different ROP gadgets. ROP is, if you're unfamiliar, is a technique used to bypass something known as NX, where we can't actually introduce code into the kernel, or PXM. And we use it, essentially, we're able to recycle the functionality that's in the code in the kernel to carry out our wishes. So in this case, we can overwrite the functionality of the ROP ioctl to instead store the very first argument into the address of the second argument and then return. So this is our arbitrary write gadget. Or we can find a ROP gadget that will read out from the very first argument the value of that address and then return that as a value. So now if we want to do an arbitrary read, we can call lseek with our file descriptor that corresponds to the file structure that we overrode, and we give to lseek as the first argument the address of the kernel value we want, or the kernel address that we want to read from, and then lseek will return the value that it read as its return value. So we use our return value as the contents of the leak. So to actually redirect the fops table, we find this functionality in the TrustZone kernel that anyone can execute, and this is a very basic command where essentially we can ask if our trustlet is loaded. So another thing I haven't mentioned yet is that all the trustlets are identified by a UUID. So while there aren't that many trustlets, each trustlet goes by a UUID, which is, I think, is a 32-byte value. It might be 16 bytes. I'm not sure. I forget. But it uses this to individually identify the different trustlets. So we can query essentially if we need to load a trustlet or if a trustlet's already loaded. And the way this works is we pass up a buffer to our TrustZone kernel, and we say, this buffer points to a UUID string. Can you make sure it doesn't exist in the currently list of loaded UUIDs? Once it does that check, so we can kind of see it here, it takes params.size, it then takes, so this makes it look like it's actually 16 bytes. So it loads the value of the UUID onto the stack, and then it calls this function trustlet needs loading, and then depending on if it needs loading, so it does need loading if it doesn't exist, it will put that to V8, and then it will write that Boolean value into the very first part of that buffer. So now you can see if we have a physical page specified, we can essentially write a Boolean true or false to any physical page in memory. Now, because we're going to be pointing this at a random piece of kernel data, which isn't going to have memory contents we control, because we're going to be pointing this at something we want to overwrite, not something we already have control of, this will almost always return true, because we're going to be pointing at something like an FOPS table, and it's going to say this FOPS table is a UUID, which doesn't correspond to anything I know about. I'm going to say, yes, you need to load whatever UUID value this corresponds to. So this essentially allows us to write a 32-bit 1 to anywhere in memory. So to take advantage of this, we're going to find an FOPS table. So we use our unmap leak to find the address of an FOPS table, and then, or a file structure which points to an FOPS table, and then we're going to overwrite that value slowly with our Boolean. So what we can do is we can start slowly point this ext4 file operations table. This is the legitimate value. And by issuing the write a number of times, we can essentially shrink it by sliding this one over and issuing multiple writes to get this into an address which corresponds to userland. So as you can see, after about 3 different writes, we get this to a very small address which will exist in a userland process and not into the kernel. And now in our own process, we can unmap this region, and we can now control file operations table pointer, and we have code execution in the kernel. Now, I hope you're not bored by how pedantic this talk is, because it's about to get a lot more memory corruption bugs. This is only the first step, so we now have root. So we have a ROP table, and we have the read and write like I mentioned. So we can actually, with this, we can overwrite the credential structure inside the kernel and essentially change all of our UIDs, which correspond to our apps UIDs, to 0, and that makes us root. So once we do that, we're actually able to completely control all the permission checking that I mentioned before that occurs in the kernel driver. So when we were just a normal userland app, in fact, when we were just an attacker app, we didn't have the ability to talk to arbitrary trustlets. We were only able to talk to this one small piece of functionality, which essentially queried if a UID was loaded, and we got fairly lucky that it allowed us to do a write. But there weren't a lot of bugs in that attack surface, besides what I mentioned, which isn't really a bug, it's just a bug in the actual page serialization. So now that we are root, we can forge our identity to the trusted core, and we can become any app we want in its eyes, so we can talk to any trustlet. Now, in this case, to find a bug, I decided to target the secure file storage. What this application does is it allows you to transparently encrypt files on disk. So Huawei has an app called Files. It's just like a basic file manager that I'm sure many people will be familiar with on their phone, but they have a feature known as the safe, and this allows you to put in a pin, and that pin will be used to encrypt any files you put into the safe. Now, they decided to implement this in TrustZone, so theoretically, if an attacker rooted your phone, they would be unable to access any files that you encrypted using the safe. So this seems pretty cool. The kernel has no idea what the key is, or definitely shouldn't. I didn't look into if there was any leak, but of course, if there are bugs in the Hijacking application, an attacker can take control of that Hijacking, or the secure storage trustlet, which does the encryption and knows the keys. They can completely get around all this and reveal the contents of those files. But for us, all we're really interested in is getting a foothold inside the secure world, so that we can then attack the trusted kernel and then find the app which corresponds to the fingerprint. So we're actually going to be targeting a bug in this Trustlet, type confusion bug, which if you don't know what type confusion is, it will become pretty clear in a second how this is a problem. So once we're the kernel driver, all we have to do is send the SMC, which has our attacker payload in it, and begin exploiting this Trustlet. Now, a little bit more about the serialization of the kernel arguments. So there's a lot of bugs with this functionality, and if you're auditing any surface, I definitely recommend looking at any sorts of serialization you see. There's always lots of bugs in it. So in this case, as I mentioned before, we have the ability to specify memory references or integers. Now, the way this is handled is your TrustZone kernel is going to actually pass up this tag tcns operation pointer, or pointer to the structure, which can handle up to 4 different parameters. Now, because we have the ability to pass up integers or memory references, a simple type checking system needs to be in place. Now, this is actually pretty easy. What they do is they have, as you can see, they have the structure on the right. It has space for exactly 4, and then they have an integer which specifies the type of every single one of those parameters. So if we have a memory reference type in our very first parameter, the most significant byte of param types will be 1. If we have an integer type in our second parameter, the second most significant byte will be 0, for example. So all this type information is stored into this NS operation structure, and now it's the responsibility of the Trustlet to check the types before it begins acting on them. So if you have a buffer argument confused with an integer argument, that can be pretty bad, because it means that any address that we put into A, an integer can be any value, can be confused as an address, and this can be used to cause havoc. So now getting into the actual param types checking, as it turns out that not a lot of Trustlets actually check these. So I guess there was some kind of miscommunication between the Trustlet developers and the kernel driver developers, and they didn't know the system worked. Now, our secure storage Trustlet actually implements a lot of different functionality that you expect to see in Linux. It has a read and write call. It also has an open, which returns a OP handle, just like the Linux kernel, and it has an lseek. Now we have this interesting bug, as you can see right here, where we take the parameter values out of the structure, but no check is ever performed before treating them actually as a buffer and a size. So we can specify an A and a B instead of a buffer and a size, and this allows us to specify any address in the Trustlet's address space. Now this is a pretty big problem. Oh, sorry guys. It's a pretty big problem because if you can imagine a Linux kernel which doesn't check the buffer argument and never make sure that the buffer argument that you're passing up to read or to write actually points into userland and not the kernel, you'd essentially have the same situation where you could arbitrarily read data into the kernel's memory space. So with this primitive, we can actually get both a leak and a write inside the Trustlet. So we can use write to read values out, and we can use read to write values in. So what we're going to do is we're going to write to a fake secure file, and we're going to write the value into that file that we want to actually do the memory write on, and then when we want to write that value into the memory of the Trustlet, we're going to read from that file, and the value that is read out will be written to an arbitrary address inside the Trustlet. And that won't get us code execution, and I'll show you how. So the one issue here is, although we have arbitrary write, we still need to point to an arbitrary payload of code. This can be kind of tricky because there's lots of different page permissions going on. We don't have really any insight into the Trustlets. This isn't like a standard ELF binary, so we don't actually know what it looks like in memory. So this was a lot of painful experimentation on my part, but it turns out that the address space of a Trustlet kind of looks like this. So at our lower addresses, we have the text section, which is all of our code. Then we have the BSS, which is like our globals. And then interestingly enough, we have the kernel, mapped in, of course, the trustlets can't write to this kernel, but it's mapped into the same virtual address space as the trustlet, just like how the Linux kernel is mapped into the same virtual address space as Userland apps. It's sort of mapped in the middle of its address, so actually the address C0000000, and then above that kernel, we actually have all the past memory references that are remapped into the trustlet's address space. So when I pass in a buffer to a trustlet, what it actually is occurring is the trusted core takes a physical page and it adds a new page table entry to the trustlet, and it's saying your buffer arguments are actually at this really high address, and everything at this page and at this address is readable, writable, and executable. So what this means is that as soon as we overwrite a function pointer inside of our BSS, we can pass in a shellcode as one of the parameters to our trustlet, and that will just be waiting for us to execute. So this gives us sort of a nice primitive where we can pass in our first argument as the file descriptor value, our second argument as the address that we want to write to, and then our third argument can actually be just an address of our shellcode that we can jump to. So by overwriting one of the function pointers inside Malloc, so their implementation of Malloc uses a function pointer table to handle different classes of size objects. This is just a coincidence of their implementation, it's just circumstances. I just took advantage of that to get code execution. So I allocate something that instead now calls my shellcode instead of calling the allocation function, and we get code execution. Now there's actually one small problem still. The truslets actually have ASLR. So if you're unfamiliar with ASLR, this stands for Address Space Layout Randomization. This is a fairly old technology used to make an attacker's life more difficult by allocating sort of code in the stack and pieces of data at random addresses. So if you do smash a stack and you get code execution, you don't know where to point your hijacked PC value to because you don't know where anything is in memory. So if the address space layout is completely random, it makes an attacker's life more difficult because although we might be able to overwrite a function pointer, we don't know where to point that to because we don't know where our shellcode is. Or in this case, we don't actually know where the function pointer is, so we don't know where to write to it. So here's the actual code inside Huawei, which generates a random value and then uses this to map in the trustlet. Now, they do this thing where they actually only implement 1 byte of entropy here. So that makes it fairly easy to break this implementation of ASLR because it means there's only 256 different places that the trustlet could be loaded. So you can imagine a number of ways that you could attack this. The truslets also are constantly, it's a very robust system, so truslets, as soon as they crash, are immediately reloaded at the same address. So we could very easily just try to exploit this 256 times with different addresses, and eventually we would make the correct guess, and we would know the address of the function pointer. But the problem gets even worse because all this information is actually just revealed in log files. So strangely enough, information about the trusted world is leaked to the normal world via the file system. So it completely defeats this mechanism, this security mitigation, because if we can just crash it once, it will log out the address that the trustlet's loaded to, and we don't need to guess 256 times, which would be trivial. We just need to guess once, fail, and then guess again, because we know the address. So this gets us code execution into the trustlet. Now we have trustlet code execution, and we're on to the final step of exploitation. I'm sure everyone's at the edge of their seats right now. This is getting very exciting. But we have the TrustZone kernel, which implements all these different mechanisms inside the trusted world that the trustlets themselves use to operate normally like apps. So they can map memory in, like I've said before, they provide IPC, they do everything you'd expect a kernel has to do for an application to function. So this trusted core has just one big vulnerability that you might suspect that's used when executing system calls or issuing system calls to the trusted core, and that is that there is absolutely no pointer sanitization whatsoever. So if you imagine a Linux kernel that never sanitizes any of the pointers you pass in, that would be a giant issue. If you aren't familiar with this, the Linux kernel has to go through any pointers. So oftentimes in Userland, we need to specify some kind of buffer argument or some kind of structure that the kernel will operate on. such as like a stat buffer. So say we want the kernel to tell us how big a file is, we need to pass in a buffer which says all the information about the file you have, write it to this buffer. Now, an attacker might think, why don't I point this buffer into the kernel's address space and have the kernel write to itself? This is a giant class of bugs that's been killed a long time ago. This all is handled because the kernel is able to check and very easily differentiate between userland addresses and kernel-land addresses. This security boundary or this check, this doesn't actually exist in the Huawei TrustZone kernel. So if I pass an address, even if it doesn't belong to my Trustlet's address space, the trusted core has no idea who this belongs to. It assumes it belongs to userland, which may not be the case, and it will just write there. So this allows us to very easily take over the trusted core. Now, strangely enough, the trusted core actually has hundreds of system calls. So we need to find a sequence of system calls that give us an arbitrary right. We don't actually need to reverse engineer the entire thing and determine what exactly system calls are doing. Now, a little bit about the environment that we're attacking. There is no ASLR, so we know exactly where the kernel is mapped inside the trusted world. I guess it's supposed to be called KSLR, which is another thing where the kernel has an address space layout randomization applied to it. There is PXN. This stands for page execute never. If you're familiar with x86, the same thing is called SMAP or SMAP, which is supervisor mode, or SMEP, supervisor mode execution prevention. So this means that our kernel will not execute code that exists in userland. There is no PAN, which stands for page access never, so the kernel can access userland memory arbitrarily. If you do have PAN, it makes your life more difficult because you have to go through a gate whenever you want to access something in userland. So arbitrary pieces of code aren't typically going to go through this gate, so if you're able to corrupt the pointer inside the kernel and point it into userland, the kernel is going to panic instead of actually trusting your reference. So the other thing which is interesting is there's no DEP, data execution prevention, also known as like write XOR X, or any region which is writable should not also be executable. This is not enforced, so the kernel heap is actually executable in this case. And there's also, like I mentioned, hundreds of system calls. In fact, there's about 300, and some of them are behind permission checks. And now I have no idea why a kernel which supports 9 different hard-coded applications, or like 9 or 6 hard-coded applications, needs to support so many different system calls. It might have something to do with Huawei just stealing this kernel from somebody else. I don't know. Would not surprise me, but they have hundreds of system calls. So there's a lot of things that we can attack and find functionality in. So this is the most pedantic slide, so I apologize, but there's nothing which actually just writes our first argument to the second argument, or vice versa, or the first argument. So it'd be incredible to have a system call which just says, I have this value, I want to write to this address, and it would perform it, but instead we need to go through this sort of dance and find a number of different system calls that, once we combine them, get us arbitrary code execution. So all these bugs, in fact the first 4, have to do with the actual pointer sanitization problem. Of course, there are other more legitimate bugs inside the kernel, so there is an integer overflow which we can use to read arbitrary addresses. I'm not going to go over this right now since I think I have about 10 minutes left. But if these slides will be online, so you can check it out later, but essentially we're able to combine all these small gadgets of functionality and make it into an arbitrary write. And we can essentially allocate a buffer inside of our trusted core kernel, use our arbitrary write to write the shellcode contents to that buffer, and then overwrite a function pointer inside of our trusted core. They get code execution. Now, we've completely own the phone now, but there's still another issue, which is I actually have no idea where the fingerprint authentication stuff is. Now, if you take the TrustZone like image bundle, which is flashed into the phone, and you take it apart, so they have a custom format which is pretty easy to reverse inside of this disk, you only get out a number of different ELF files, which are your trustlets. You have something called the keymaster, which handles crypto services. You have your sec storage. You have something known as the gatekeeper, but there's nothing in there which looks like fingerprint checking, and everything there is also pretty small. Our biggest file is 105K. Fingerprint recognition logic, which sort of can fuzzily tell if a fingerprint resembles another image, should be pretty complex, I would think, and larger than 100K. So how do we find this? So I think this is, Fingerprint D is actually a default Android service. I could be wrong, but I think this is actually something on all Android phones, which is open source. But to handle different vendors' implementations of fingerprint recognition services, the vendor has to map in a shared object file into that, which takes care of all the functionality that this binary will call out to do the fingerprint checks. So if you look at the memory maps of Fingerprint D, we find this thing interesting which says lib fpc tac shared. Now tac sounds like trusted agent something, and fpc obviously sounds like fingerprint something. I don't know what the C's are, but this looked interesting to me, so I checked it out. And of course what we see here is something that resembles Huawei's TrustZone API. So Huawei implements their own API known as Teak to implement with their, or to interact with their TrustZone architecture. So as you can see, we have this really suspicious looking string, system bin uuid.sec, and then that's passed into an open session call. Now if you look at this .sec, it just says data. So if you run file on it, unlike other trustlets, it's not going to say it's an elf, it's going to say it's actually just an arbitrary blob of data. So this says to me is an encrypted trustlet. Now, why did Huawei feel the need to encrypt this trustlet and not others? I'll lead that up to the audience to figure out why they might want to do something shady like that. It could be a security reason, it could be something else, but they do feel the need to encrypt whatever code is in that trustlet. So to actually get to this, what we're going to have to do is leverage our trusted core code execution to leak out the contents of this trustlet. And this is the way a lot of leaking of encrypted data is done. So on iPhone, if they want to leak the kernel cache, what they can do is they can wait till it's loaded, use a bug from an older system that's been disclosed, and then they can leak out the contents of the decrypted memory, because this needs to be decrypted for it to run. So once our fingerprint logic is working, and then we can check this physically by just making sure that we can authenticate with a fingerprint, we know that code must be decrypted somewhere in memory, and with a trusted core, we have access to all the physical memory on the device. So what we can do, we can crawl all of our physical memory looking for ARM instructions, and whenever we find ARM instruction, we can dump the memory around it and look for references to just literal strings like fingerprint and fingerprint D. This is a pretty naive approach, but it happened to work. Once I was able to do that, I actually could dump out an entire unstripped ELF file. So what this means is that the ELF file actually had complete symbols. It was very easy to reverse engineer. And I essentially found a function called identify image, which happened to correspond to the recognize fingerprint functionality. And from there, we can essentially get this to essentially always return true. We patch that in, and now fingerprint checking works. That's actually the end of my talk. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Now, I have a more interesting demo here, which will actually demonstrate unlocking the phone using the exploit with my nose. So, one second. So, hopefully everyone can see this. I know it's pretty far away. So I just started the phone, so I actually have to unlock it with a pin. But now I can lock the phone, all right? And now if I want to use my fingerprint to unlock it, so I think it's this one, or maybe it's this one. Okay, so I can use my finger to unlock the phone. I hope everyone saw that. I can't just arbitrarily use other body parts yet, or other fingers. But if I run my exploit, so I just have it as an app on the phone. It's not 100% reliable. It's not, okay, it did work this time. But, okay, so it's now pwned the trust zone. So now I should be able to use my nose. All right. Okay, so, yeah. All right, that's essentially the end of my talk. I have room in here for Q&A. I don't know if this conference does it, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'll be right here after the talk if you want to talk to me. And one more thing, I do work for Raytheon CSI, and if you found that interesting, or if you think this is kind of work you would like to do, this is sort of what I do for a job. I look for memory corruption bugs, and I get to exploit them. So if you would like to do this as a full-time job, it's completely possible. Just talk to me, yeah, we're always hiring, so and I'll be around after the talk. Thanks, everybody.